Hello, I'm Adrian Fox.
I'm Tracy Wise.
And welcome to the very first Mystery on Sea podcast.
I am a magician and a storyteller, and I like to research the history and the mystery of places and weave them together. I like to refer to myself as a mystorian. So not quite full historian, but more into the mystery, so a mystorian.
And I've lived in Southend since I was about 3 years old, which is far too long ago, and I'm not prepared to go into more details than that. But like Tracy, I'm also a magician and also interested in the history of our fascinating town. And when we got together, we decided it's about time that some of the untold stories were told. Hence, the Mystery on Sea tour was born, and since then we've had quite a few hundred people come and do the walk with us, and we hope to see you on one of the walks one day soon. But in the meantime, we thought it'd be quite a nice idea to put together a little podcast and tell you about some of the stories we've heard.
We'll be telling you stories of history and mystery, of intrigue and perhaps even murder, about not only our fair town but the fair county of Essex as well, which is rich in history and mystery of all sorts.
So let's get started. So looking up at the Royal Hotel from just outside the front door, I mean, it's a magnificent building, and not much has changed really since it was first built back in 1791. That seems like a long time ago, Tracy.
It does. An entire world ago, 1791. You wouldn't even think of it looking at the building. It looks quite contemporary, especially with other features around it, and it certainly stood the test of time, I think.
It has. If you look at the original drawings of the building, the only thing that's changed really is that these days there are now windows on the roof, which indicates that they've probably extended up in the roof for office space or something like that. But the original sign is still there, the original entrance is still there with the portal, and it's just an amazing place. They've really tastefully modernised the building inside as well, but there are still some very atmospheric areas that you can visit, such as the ballroom on the first floor. That's got a huge history, hasn't it?
It has. It's not just any old ballroom. It's a hauntingly beautiful ballroom with lots of reported activity from the different kind of spirits than perhaps they're serving from the cocktail bar.
For example, Princess Caroline, and that incidentally is why the place is called the Royal Hotel, because Princess Caroline, who went on to marry the Prince of Wales at the time, who would have become George IV, that's why it's called the Royal Hotel. She stayed here for the best part of 3 months. But in 1805, we also had Lady Emma Hamilton here with Lord Nelson, and she held a very special ball for Nelson on the first floor of the Royal Hotel in that year, and it was literally just a couple of months before he was killed at Trafalgar. And there are stories that you can still see things going on in the dead of night.
So one of the first recorded reports of ghostly activity in the hotel goes back to the 1800s, and visitors to the hotel would often state and often question staff there about the strange figures they would see in the mirrors. So they would look into the mirror, perhaps to correct their own dress, their own hat, and they would see the reflections of strange people with pointy hats staring back at them. And of course, when they would turn around, there would be nothing there. And this seemed to be a regular occurrence. In fact, people seeing reflections and mirrors being portals to the other world is quite a common theme throughout most sort of ghostly tales in our country.
There are also stories of orbs. Now,
Yes.
Tracy, you've heard different stories about orbs and whether or not people believe them or not.
So I remember when I was growing up, programs like Most Haunted with the beloved Derek Acora and such like, and the fascination with orbs, which only really seemed to have become a prominent thing since digital photography, really. So I've always been quite sceptical about what orbs may or may not be. But some of the stories coming from the hotel here, from the staff, perhaps suggest something different. So when you hear accounts of footage actually being captured on the security cameras here in the ballroom in the dead of night, no one else around, and these orbs of light are not just floating around the room but actually weaving between the balustrades of the features that are up there, that does take further investigation really, and makes one question, perhaps there could be more to this.
And there have been all sorts of stories from the people that work in the Royal Hotel Things like the friendly hand on the shoulder, just pushing down slightly to let you know that there is something going on there. Strange tales of doorknobs on the ballroom turning even though there is no doorknob on the other side of the door. It's a fascinating building, isn't it?
It is. There is so much history there and so much mystery that it definitely warrants further investigation.
One of the beauties of visiting Southend-on-Sea, and particularly the Clifftown Conservation Area, is that you get to see a whole variety of different things. And the history around here is quite remarkable. I mean, here we are now standing along Royal Terrace, looking out across the estuary, overseeing the pier. And from here you get a magnificent view of the pier and the seafront. Adventure Island is down there, of course, which is a more modern development. But if you turn around and look the other way, you'll be staring at the houses of Royal Terrace, which have a very special significance for the town.
First of all, this is the last surviving example of Georgian architecture in the town, and it's obviously very protected and it's quite stunning. And it links to our stories with the Royal Hotel and, of course, the infamous Lady Hamilton and Princess Caroline, both of whom stayed in a number of these properties over the years.
7, 8 and 9 seem to be the houses that most people believe that Lady Caroline of Brunswick stayed. Now, as we said earlier, Caroline went on to marry the future George IV, even though the two of them couldn't stand the sight of each other, to the point where actually he had to be held up by two of his mates at the wedding day because he was plastered, so completely drunk. And of course, poor old Lady Caroline reported that the wedding night was less than spectacular.
I don't know if you're familiar with the nursery rhyme, Georgie, Porgy, Pudding and Pie kissed the girls and made them cry. Well, one of those girls was Lady Caroline, because, yep, he absolutely detested her to the point that she was banned from his coronation as well.
But Royal Terrace is actually one of the most haunted spots in Southend-on-Sea. Along this stretch, there are stories of all sorts of ghostly sightings, aren't there?
Even back to the 1800s, some of the properties along here were guest houses, much as they are now. And again, one of the first reported sightings, if you like, of a ghostly encounter was in one of those residences where a visitor was woken in the middle of the night by a pair of ghostly eyes just staring at them from the end of the bed. Obviously, they woke up quite surprised, and when they yelled out, the eyes seemed to disappear. And this went on for a number of days until the point when the visitor decided to move on and go somewhere else. And nobody really knows who those eyes belonged to. But that's just the first recorded story. Other stories we've heard are of, in several of the properties, the sound of what appears to be furniture being dragged across the floor, and yet when people have gone up to those rooms, there is no furniture there is nobody there. Even somebody on one of our walks who once lived in one of these properties said yes, they also heard such noises, sort of like bumps and scrapes and the sound of things being moved around.
But one of the buildings along here, which is in a pretty sorry state of repair, is actually probably the most haunted building in the town, and it's got a very sad story attached to it, because at the moment it's surrounded by scaffolding and plastic, and even
No.
Sorry.
It's shrouded in mystery.
Yes, sorry about that. Yes, shrouded in mystery with scaffolding and plastic sheeting, and even the plastic sheeting has seen better days, to be fair. But that particular building is especially active, isn't it?
It is. So reports of this are as recent as the 1960s, and the reports show that a young couple that were living there started to hear sounds of things being moved around, ghostly shadows, a sense that they weren't alone. Even at one point, as well, as things progressed, the sense that something was trying to pull them out of the bed. The accounts suggest what we would refer to as poltergeist type activity, which seemed to get worse over time. They did actually call upon the church to conduct an exorcism, which is not something that the church undertakes lightly, and an exorcism was actually performed there, and for a while things seemed to settle down, but over time the activity started to build again and seemed to be becoming more and more intense, and so in fear for their own lives, really, they decided to move on.
And now as you stand and look at the building, it looks very sad. The top floor, several of the panes of glass are missing, but apparently the reason it's in that shoddy condition is because the chap that owned it decided to make a lot of changes to the building. Unfortunately, fell foul of the listed building laws and was promptly told, well, you're going to have to put it back, but couldn't afford to do it.
No, it's quite a costly encounter, and in fact it's quite sad that a number of the properties along this terrace are in quite a sorry state of repair. So I don't know, maybe we should start a crowdfunder to purchase one of them, set up our own Mystery on Sea museum. What do you think?
We've picked a beautiful day to come out and about, and here we are still in Royal Terrace and just walking along the shrubbery garden which is opposite the buildings. Now, back in the day when this was originally built, this was actually a private garden for the residents and the guests of Royal Terrace, and Queen Victoria's 7th child, Prince Arthur, was known to stroll along here when he stayed in Southend, because he was going to the Shoebury Garrison to gunnery school, and every morning he would get up and take a stroll along the gardens here before catching a carriage down to Shoebury Garrison where he'd be trained. But this particular area has got such a lot of history to it, and when we've just come to the end of the gardens, you look down the road and you can see these magnificent buildings, and the frontises of these buildings are just incredible, aren't they?
They are absolutely stunning, and all of these, of course, when they were originally built, would have been private residences. Many of them now are shared accommodation, boutique hotels and tea rooms.
So as we head back onto the pavement now, we're just heading down towards the cliff lift, which in itself is an amazing feat of engineering when you consider that this was built in 1912, so it's been there over 100 years, still run today by volunteers. But right next to the cliff's lift, there was, at one time, another little building built onto the cliff. It was the Alexander Yacht Club, and now as we stand facing the seafront, you can see, let into the cliff, there are metal sheets that are there to try and support the ground where the yacht club used to be.
I'd hardly call it a little building, though. It was quite grand and magnificent in its day, and it's such a sad fate that befell it. Like many of our wonderful features in Southend, fire seems to be a bit of a theme, as you may pick up on as we go along. But the yacht club was not only just a beautiful building, but also played host to a couple of very, very famous and mystical characters themselves.
Yeah, Conan Doyle, no less.
Sir Arthur, I think you'll find, absolutely.
Or art to his mates.
Absolutely. He gave a talk here on one of his many visits to members of the yacht club, and also Mr. Harry Houdini.
Yes, quite remarkable. Around about the end of March in 1911, Harry Houdini came and played a week of shows at the Southend Hippodrome Theatre. And if you're not sure where that used to be, if you're anywhere near the Victoria Circus shopping centre, just take a look at where Greggs is now and look to your left, and that's where the theatre used to be. But Harry Houdini was there for a week at the end of March in 1911, played a week of sell-out shows, and on the Saturday afternoon he came to the Alexander Yacht Club and took on a private engagement for somebody's birthday party. So we are truly treading in the footsteps of legends.
I know, when you think about it, when you think about the people that have actually visited our fair town, and this, even just this small area, so Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Harry Houdini, Stan and Ollie, Laurel and Hardy actually visited the town, stayed at what's now known as the Park Inn, the Palace Hotel, and also we have references to Bram Stoker, and there's even a reference, H.G. Wells wrote about our fair town in War of the Worlds, so that's not bad for what was really at the time quite a small town.
So if you walk along a little bit further from Royal Terrace, you will eventually arrive at a place of royalty.
We can bow in front of Her Majesty, Queen Victoria. Beautiful statue that originally was placed at the top of Pier Hill, just outside the Palace Hotel. And Her Majesty was regally pointing out to sea towards the pier, or so people originally thought, until somebody pointed out that actually she appeared to be pointing towards the gentlemen's toilets, after which they decided to move her along to this area here. But she's had a bit of an interesting history since she's been here, I think.
Yes, you're not joking. She was moved here in the 1960s, originally gifted to the town in 1897 to mark the Queen's Jubilee. However, once it was moved, somebody decided that they wanted a souvenir of Her Majesty, so climbed up the statue and promptly broke her finger off.
Ouch.
It was nasty. I mean, that was replaced And now,
Yeah.
unfortunately, there is a bit of a snag.
There is. So when they were creating the new sort of forearm and hand to place on there, it needed to be modelled on someone, and it appears that it was modelled on a male arm. So Her Majesty is now sporting what appears to be quite a masculine looking forearm and hand, which is a little bit disproportionate to the rest of it.
Just a bit. And of course, if you turn away from the sea and look across the road, you will see several listed buildings which are still here and still occupied. And one of them in particular, the Glen Eagles Guest House, has been there for many, many years and is currently looked after by Gary and Penny Lowen. And it is a magnificent building, and we've been there many, many times for cups of tea and coffee, and it's always got a lovely atmosphere, hasn't it?
It's got a long history. Fortunately, not that we've been able to discover so far any ghostly history, but Gary and Penny have been strong supporters of Mystery on Sea since the very beginning, and it's just got a beautiful ambience to it, and it's such a historic building. I love it in there.
One of the great things about running our Mystery on Sea walk is that you get to see some of the sights in the town that most people would walk by and not notice. For example, if you come to the corner of Capel Terrace and Alexandra Road, you'll find a very old-fashioned looking phone box.
Ah, but it is more than just a phone box. It is indeed the smallest museum in the country. And it tells a potted history of the local area and features one of our most famous celebrities that used to go to school in Southend, and that is, of course, Helen Mirren.
And if you come along to the phone box and pop in, then you can listen to Helen Mirren telling you the story of Southend and the Clifftown area, which, of course, is what we try to do in a little bit more detail on our Mystery on Sea walk. So. But the great thing about it is if you stand outside the phone box, there is a little thing, isn't there?
There is. There's a little thing that, and if you press the button...
Does it work?
I don't know.
Shall we find it? Yeah, give it a go.
Let's give it a go. Ready?
Push the old button and let's see what happens. Oh.
Hello, welcome. I'm Helen Mirren, and as a former local girl who used this phone box, walked the pier, and attended St Bernard's High School, I'm here to introduce the Clifftown Museum, one of the world's smallest museums.
A lot of people don't realise that actually Southend High Street is a fairly new addition to the town, because back in the old days the high street for the town was Nelson Street, which is where we're standing now. If you look in one direction you can see the polythene-clad university building and of course Southend Central Station, and if you turn and look the other way you just about get a view of the Thames estuary and of course the Clifftown Church. Now this particular road of course these days plays home to firms of solicitors, there's the Railway Hotel and all sorts of things, and even here you can see plenty of references to Nelson and Lady Emma Hamilton. There's a building called Victory House and so on and so forth. But these buildings have got quite a bit of history.
They have. So first of all, if you look at the structure of them as well, lots of people walk past, they see the raised steps, the beautiful ornate ironwork, but many people don't realise the purpose of these steps. So originally, when this was the heaving high street for the area, there would have been lots of sort of dirt tracks and mud, and the steps were here so that the wealthy that would be shopping here would pull up in their carriages and could step from the carriage to the steps without, of course, dragging all their beautiful clothing in the mud and the dirt. And one of the shops here used to be a certain shop for certain people selling certain items. I don't know if I should say out loud.
Oh, go on, I dare you.
Well, it was the local shop for local masons, and it's where they used to come to buy their Masonic regalia, things like aprons and what have you, which I know nothing about. But what is interesting as well, that many of these shops along here, which are now offices, have basements. We do like a good basement story, don't we? Basements, cellars are often dark and damp places, certainly along here. But at number 5, that used to be the shop selling the Masonic regalia, there used to be some jewellers in the basement, and there were stories there of ghostly goings on, of strange shadows, of the sense that people were never really on their own. And many people that have worked along here over the years have said that they too just have that sense that there's something else there with them, so many of them won't actually go into the cellars or use them.
I can't say that I blame them, really. But this particular area of Southend, the Clifftown area, all came about because of the arrival of the railway. before the railway turned up, if you lived anywhere out of the town, it took an age to get here. You'd have to come in on a horse or in a carriage, and so not many people visited the town. But when the railway arrived in the mid-1800s, it changed everything. And of course the railway company's job was to sell seats on their trains. They wanted people to use the railway so that they could make some money. But not many people were using the trains. So in order to improve the situation and their fortune, they decided to lease a huge plot of land from the railway line right the way down to the cliffs, and they built, at a cost of around £100,000, which in those days was an awful lot of money, they built some houses, first, second and third class accommodation, which people could then buy and live in, and as a result the commuter trade was born. People had to travel to London to work, and of course by living here they would spend money on railway tickets.
And the railway itself has an interesting tale that perhaps we'll tell you about another time. It used to go deep into the heart of London and into a particular area known as Whitechapel. And there are some suggestions that perhaps our fair town might be linked with one of the most infamous cases, unsolved crime in the world, that of Jack the Ripper. But we'll tell you about that another day.
One of the sights you'll see on our Mystery on Sea Walk is the church along Nelson Street, which was originally the church for the Clifftown area. These days it's no longer consecrated, and in fact it's been taken over by the local educational establishment, the college and the university, and it's actually used for their performing arts. And they put on several really good shows in here, including one by your good self, I think.
Absolutely, yes. I did perform Nursery Crimes here a couple of years ago now in a beautiful studio upstairs with the original stained glass window as the backdrop. It's quite a special space inside. Very, very beautiful.
We're standing here now looking at a memorial stone that's been let into the side of the church, and we've never seen this before.
We haven't. So there you go, a bit of a mystery that's come to light. So it says, "To the glory of God, this memorial stone was laid by John Greenwood, Esquire, of Southend on Sea, this 22nd day of August 1889. And what drew our attention was the architect, who was from Brighton, is one E.J. Hamilton. Coincidence? Perhaps.
If you wander down to the end of the High Street, close to the Pier Hill end of the High Street, you'll end up standing on a corner of a little road known as Royal Mews. And at the far end of the mews you'll find lots of converted stables that have now been turned into quite nice looking apartments.
A lot of them were renovated back in the 1980s, so it was part of the development. Originally, when the hotel was first built, they were stables, but as they needed more and more accommodation, they got converted into these sort of working cottages. And what's interesting as well is, of course, that one of them is also supposed to have a ghostly story attached to it, one of intrigue and perhaps murder.
And in fact, every Christmas Eve, they hold a bit of a party in there, don't they?
Apparently so. This is what we're led to believe, because every Christmas Eve at the stroke of midnight, apparently it's possible to hear the sound of ghostly hooves of horses galloping over the cobblestones, but of course there are no horses there. So I'll be there this Christmas Eve, socially distancing of course. Come join me if you like, bring a flask.
Yes, vastly inflated ticket prices of course. And not only are there no horses there anymore, but there are no cobbles there either anymore, which makes it even more bizarre.
And ghostly.
In ghostly. But at the other end of Royal Mews, there stands a building which now houses a gymnasium on the ground floor, but this used to be a haberdashery shop known as Brightwell's. And I remember as a child going into there, and they had one of these chain pulley systems around the store where they would put things like till receipts and cash into these little baskets and pull the handle and it would whiz off around the store.
I have seen these things in museums and on TV programmes. Yes.
Thank you. Yes, not making me feel any better. Thank you for that. But the point is, if you look up at the top of the building on the very corner of Royal Mews, you will see there is a sort of a cupola, I think that's the term,
I think
like
so.
a little turret up there with a flagpole on top of it, and there's quite an interesting story attached to that as well.
Indeed. So the story says that the owner of the building was so in love, so passionate about his job, his work, his business, that when he died, his ashes were placed into an urn, and the urn was placed into that feature. to remain there forever undisturbed. And as far as we know, they do indeed still remain there to this day.
What we do know is that the entrance to that little feature is locked and nobody knows where the key is.
No, yet. But perhaps one day.
So that just about brings us to the end of our first Mystery on Sea podcast. We hope you've enjoyed listening to some of the stories we've discovered over the last couple of years about the fabulous Clifftown and Royal Terrace areas of Southend on Sea. But of course you may have your own stories to tell about these amazing buildings and some of the experience you might have had. And if you have, we would love to hear from you.
So please do drop us a line. You can message us via our Facebook page, Mystery on Sea, or you can email us via the website, www.mysteryonsea.com. So please do drop us a line. Tell us about your stories. Help us keep the history and mystery of our fair county alive, because we love sharing these stories with you, but we want to hear your stories too.
So thanks for listening, and we hope to see you again very soon on our second Mystery on Sea podcast.